The streets of Salou, the capital of Burkina Faso, pulsed with an uneasy energy. A military parade had just concluded, but beneath the marching boots and fluttering flags, something else was moving, something unspoken. In the Unity Palace, President Ibrahim Traoré sat in silence, his hands folded on the wooden desk that had once belonged to a French colonial governor. The air conditioning hummed softly, but the heat of uncertainty was unmistakable. For weeks, whispers had swirled through African and European intelligence circles. A secret summit in Lisbon, Portugal. Officially, it was a cooperation conference for African and EU leaders. But Ibrahim knew better. His advisors had intercepted communications between General Etienne Rousseau, head of French military operations in West Africa, and Ambassador Harold Kessler of the United States. The summit wasn't about cooperation, it was about containment of him. Traoré had become an irritant, a stone in the boot of Western interests. Since expelling French troops and aligning with new regional powers, his popularity among African youth had soared, but so had the fury in Washington and Paris. Now he had received a personal invitation to attend the summit, but the invitation wasn't signed by a president or a prime minister. It came from Elena Wexler, chairwoman of the Atlantic Stability Forum, an organization backed by NATO and rumored to have ties to clandestine operations. "It's a trap," whispered Colonel Mariam Sawadogo, his chief intelligence officer and longtime ally. Traoré's eyes remained fixed on the envelope. "Then let's walk into it with our eyes open. Sir, we have options: virtual attendance, delegation by proxy." He raised a hand. "This isn't about attendance. This is about sending a message. If they think I'm scared, they win." Across the room, a large screen blinked to life. A secure line had been opened to Moscow. Sergei Dubrov, a soft-spoken Russian security advisor with sharp instincts and colder eyes, appeared. "You are aware of the risks, Mr. President?" Sergei asked in French-accented English. "I am. That's why I want your jets ready." There was a pause. "Understood." 3 days later, the Falcon 900 aircraft, marked with the crest of Burkina Faso, lifted off from the Ouagadougou military airstrip. On board was President Traoré, Colonel Sawadogo, and a skeleton crew of hand-picked personnel. The plan was simple: a direct flight to Lisbon. No stopovers, no delay. But Traoré's instincts, honed on the battlefield and sharpened in palace halls, told him this would be anything but simple. As the aircraft rose above the clouds, the president reclined in his seat and stared out the window. Below him, the red soil of Burkina Faso faded into haze. Ahead of him lay a city dressed in diplomacy, but built on manipulation. He turned to Mariam. "Do you trust the Portuguese?" She hesitated. "Officially, yes. Unofficially, they've hosted covert NATO operations since the Cold War. Lisbon is friendly soil, but not ours." Traoré smiled faintly. "Then we'll see who's friend and who's host." The first half of the flight went smoothly. Over the Canary Islands, the crew began their descent toward Lisbon airspace. But then the alert came. 2 unidentified aircraft were approaching at high speed. The pilot, Captain Jules Tambura, tightened his grip on the controls. "Mr. President, we have company. Fast movers. No transponder ID." Traoré's face remained unreadable. "Visual? 2 Eurofighter Typhoons. Likely Spanish or British." Colonel Sawadogo's hand moved to her sidearm out of reflex. "What the hell are they doing here?" The radio crackled. A crisp British voice came through. "Unidentified aircraft. This is air control. You are requested to reroute your flight path and land at Morón Air Base in Spain. Repeat, land immediately." Tambura glanced back. "Orders, sir?" The cabin fell silent. "Ignore them," Traoré said. "We are en route to Lisbon under diplomatic clearance. Keep our course." On the screen in front of them, Sergei Dubrov reappeared. He had been monitoring the radar from afar. "We have scrambled 2 escort fighters from Kaliningrad, rerouted through Algerian airspace. ETA, 18 minutes. Mariam raised an eyebrow. "That's fast." "Not fast enough," Traoré muttered. The jets were now flying parallel with their aircraft, visible through the cabin windows. Sleek, deadly. "Watching. I've seen this move before," he said. "They'll either force us down or force a mistake." Mariam leaned forward. Sir, if this escalates, it won't. His tone was firm. Not on our side. But then one of the typhoons suddenly accelerated and banked sharply toward their plane. Contact imminent, Captain Tambara shouted. Inside the cockpit, alarms began to wail. The typhoon had locked on. No missiles fired, but the signal was unmistakable. A show of force. The radio hissed again. This is not a request. Divert or face consequence. Traoré looked out the window, stared directly at the approaching jet, and whispered, "You really think we'll blink first?" Far above the Atlantic, with radar systems lit up and nerves stretched to breaking, a confrontation was now inevitable. The typhoon roared past the presidential jet, missing it by just over 100 feet. The Falcon 900 rocked violently in its slipstream, passengers gripping their seats as alarms wailed. In the cockpit, Captain Tambara fought with the controls, leveling the aircraft with steady, practiced hands. "That wasn't a warning," Colonel Merriam said, eyes burning. "That was a provocation." "Or a test," Traoré replied calmly. "They want to see if I'll blink. Let's show them I don't have eyelids." Back on the radar, the second Eurofighter shifted position, flanking them closer than before. On the comms, the British voice returned, this time with an edge. "Final warning, divert to Morone Air Base, or we will escort you by force." Captain Tambaro opened the line to reply, but Traoré touched his shoulder. "Don't," the president said. "We don't answer ultimatums." Miriam's tablet buzzed, a coded message. She decrypted it quickly. Her eyes narrowed. "We've just intercepted satellite data. Portuguese air control is denying responsibility. They claim these jets aren't operating under Lisbon's orders." "So they're rogue?" Tambara asked. "No," Traoré said. "They're invisible. This isn't about jurisdiction. It's about narrative control. If we're forced down or something goes wrong, Portugal can deny involvement. Clean hands, dirty skies." Just then, Sergei Dubrov's face lit up the screen again. "We are entering your airspace now. Our fighters will reach your position in 5 minutes. Any word from Lisbon?" Miriam asked. "They've gone silent," Sergei said flatly. "Someone else is making the calls." Suddenly, the second typhoon dropped altitude and fell behind the Falcon. The first moved to the nose, a clear boxing maneuver. Forced descent imminent. Tambara's voice was tight. "We have 2 options. Climb sharply and risk stall, or drop toward the water and try to break the lock." "We don't run," Traoré said. "Hold course." Even as the fighters boxed them in, the Falcon continued forward like a spear through the storm. Then, from the east, 2 Russian Su-35s burst through the cloud line like ghosts with teeth. They didn't announce their arrival. They didn't need to. The British pilot must have seen them on radar first, because the typhoons hesitated. One broke formation slightly, its nose twitching to the side. The radio flared with static. Then a sharp, Russian-accented voice. "This is Russian Air Command. Burkina Faso. 1 is under our protection. Disengage immediately." Silence. Then another Russian voice, colder than steel. "If you engage, we will respond." The typhoons held their position for a moment, longer than they should have. Inside the Falcon, the tension was suffocating. Miriam's hand hovered over her sidearm, as if instinct alone could fire a shot through the sky. But then, slowly, the typhoons peeled away. No flare, no threats, just silence and withdrawal. Captain Tambara exhaled. "They're gone." "Not gone," Traoré corrected. "Just outplayed." The Su-35s slid into position on either side of the Falcon, close enough for the pilots to see the glint in each other's eye. The Russian wing leader gave a short nod through the canopy. A wordless message. "You are not alone." The rest of the flight to Lisbon was uneventful, but not quiet. Traoré remained locked in thought, his fingers drumming lightly against the armrest. He was not naive. This wasn't the end. This was only the opening move. "We humiliated them," Miriam said softly, "and they won't forget." "I'm not here to be remembered," he replied. "I'm here to be obeyed." As the Lisbon skyline came into view, the sun dipped low across the Atlantic, turning the sea into a sheet of burning gold. From the window, the Unity Palace flag shimmered on the tail of their aircraft, proud and defiant. The landing gear extended. The tarmac at Lisbon International waited. But just as they began final approach, the radio crackled again. Burkina Faso 1. This is tower control. You are cleared to land at alternate site Bravo. Repeat, alternate site Bravo. Coordinates to follow. Tambadara looked confused. That's not the main airport. Miriam cross-checked the coordinates. Her eyes widened. That's Montijo Air Base, she said. Military. NATO controlled. Traoré's voice was low but fierce. They're still trying. What's the play? Tambadara asked. We ignore it? Traoré thought for a long moment. No, he said finally. We land exactly where they want us. Miriam turned sharply. Sir, that's insane. That's strategic, he corrected. You don't beat a snake by stepping over it. You step on its head. The falcon descended, slicing through the orange haze of dusk, bound not for diplomacy, but for confrontation. And Ibrahim Traoré, unshaken by the powers that once drew maps of his continent in pencil and blood, was ready to redraw them with truth's steel and no permission. The Falcon 900's tires screeched softly against the tarmac of Montijo Air Base, a sterile stretch of concrete nestled far from the press, far from protocol, and more importantly, far from witnesses. Inside the cabin, the silence was surgical. Colonel Mariam Sawadogo unbuckled her seatbelt, her fingers moving quickly to the pistol holstered beneath her blazer. They moved us off civilian radar. Nobody knows we're here, sir. I do. President Ibrahim Traoré replied evenly. That's enough. The door opened with a hiss, and the dry coastal air of Lisbon swept in. Waiting on the runway were 3 black armored SUVs, and a man in a dark suit who could have been a banker or an assassin. He stepped forward, flanked by armed men in plain clothes. President Traoré, he said with a stiff nod. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm the special liaison from the Atlantic Stability Forum. We appreciate your flexibility in adjusting your arrival. I didn't adjust anything, Traoré said, stepping down the stairs. You did, without my consent. Mercer smiled thinly. Your security is our concern. The summit location has changed for safety. Lisbon was deemed too exposed. Mariam muttered under her breath. Exposed to whom? Their own press? Mercer gestured toward the SUVs. Please. It's a short drive. Traoré hesitated. Then he looked at his team. 3 cars. We split. I ride alone. Mariam frowned. Sir, no arguments. If they want to control the setting, let's give them less to control inside it. Within minutes, the convoy was speeding through the outskirts of Lisbon, passing warehouses, empty ports and military zones. This wasn't diplomacy. This was a detour. The buildings outside grew darker, more isolated. Traoré watched them in silence until the convoy finally stopped in front of a windowless gray compound. A private NATO annex. No flag, no emblem, no journalists. This isn't a summit, he said aloud. It's an interrogation. Mercer stepped out and opened the rear door himself. We're inside. Traoré entered the compound with the stride of a man who had nothing to prove, but everything to confront. Inside, the lighting was dim and the hallways sterile. Cameras were everywhere, and guards lingered in the shadow. Finally, he was led into a long room with a polished black table. No podiums, no media, no press badges, just silence. Already seated at the table were 3 figures. General Etienne Rousseau, the man who had led French operations across the Sahel before Traoré kicked him out of Burkina Faso. Ambassador Harold Kessler, the American diplomat known for destabilizing fragile governments with the stroke of a pen. And Elena Wexler, the woman who had orchestrated the entire summit, the ghost behind the curtain. Traoré took his seat without greeting. Rousseau was the first to speak, his voice dripping with old-world condescension. President Traoré, your journey has caused a great deal of concern. You could have addressed us through proper channels. I prefer altitude. Traoré replied, the air is cleaner up there. Elena Wexler steepled her fingers. This isn't a formal session, President. It's an opportunity for frankness. Unofficial, off the record. No flags, no speeches. Only pressure, he said. Kessler leaned forward. Let's not waste time. Your alignment with Moscow is destabilizing. Your expulsion of French and American troops has opened security gaps. We believe this path endangers both your country and the region. Traoré let the words hang in the air before answering. You mean it endangers your access? Elena's voice was calm but sharp. You don't see the bigger picture. I see it clearer than you'd like, he said. A continent bled for generations now refuses transfusion from its abusers. Rousseau's jaw tensed. Watch your tone. Traoré didn't blink. I watched your tanks roll into Mali. I watched your NGOs spy on villages. I've watched long enough. Kessler stood. If you continue down this path, you'll find no aid, no trade, no cooperation. We're willing to talk but not beg. Traoré stood too. And I'm willing to walk, not crawl. Wexler raised a hand. Gentlemen, sit. Both men hesitated. Traoré remained standing. We're not here to bully you, she said. We're here to offer a final path. We propose a trilateral security arrangement. Joint forces stationed under neutral command. Funding, equipment, training, supervision. Traoré cut in. Occupation in disguise. No, Wexler said, rising slowly. A compromise. I didn't come to Europe to compromise, he said. I came to show that Africa will no longer be manipulated under velvet gloves. Outside, Mariam and the other team members were growing uneasy. Their radios crackled with encrypted interference. Something was jamming their signals. Back in the meeting room, Traoré stepped away from the table and faced the three figures directly. I suggest you reconsider, Wexler said. You're not untouchable, Mr. Traoré. Leaders fall, regimes change. He stared at her without blinking. So do empires. The room froze. Then, in a moment that would remain classified in every intelligence report, Traoré reached into his coat and pulled out a small encrypted transceiver. He pressed a single button. In orbit above Earth, a classified Russian military satellite activated its relay. Within seconds, a global signal was jammed, and every word of the conversation inside that room was recorded, encrypted and sent to secure servers across 5 continents. Insurance. Traoré smiled. Now shall we begin the real summit? For a brief moment, the room was frozen in time. General Rousseau reached instinctively for his belt. Old soldier habits die hard, but found nothing there. Ambassador Kessler narrowed his eyes. Elena Wexler said nothing, her lips tightening as if calculating 1,000 variables all at once. The transceiver in President Ibrahim Traoré's hand blinked once, then went dark, but its purpose had been fulfilled. A line had been crossed, and for once, it wasn't the African leader who had to defend himself. You recorded this meeting, Wexler finally said, her voice low and tense. I recorded history, Traoré replied, and ensured it cannot be edited. Kessler stepped forward, voice sharpened by diplomatic fury. You'll cause a rupture with this stunt. You think your people can survive economic isolation? Sanctions? Cut supply chain? I think they've survived worse. Traoré said calmly, slave ships, bayonets, IMF loans. Rousseau scoffed. You'll regret this. No, you will. Traoré snapped, his voice rising for the first time. Because for the first time, the world will hear how you threaten elected leaders behind closed doors. And they'll hear it from my voice. The lights flickered. The compound systems were reacting to the external signal disruption. Elena Wexler moved toward a control panel on the wall, but stopped short. You're not the only one who can play this game, she said. We have ways of responding, but not erasing, Traoré replied. This isn't a coup, Miss Wexler. It's a confession. Outside, Mariam Soadogo and her team had broken the signal jamming. Their encrypted headset connection roared back to life. Signals restored, said her lieutenant. We have location lockdown. The Russians are online. Mariam keyed into the secure frequency. Initiate broadcast protocol. Codename Sovereign Flame. The order was simple. Beam the encrypted summit. Feed to a secure server. Co-managed by Burkina Faso, Algeria, and South Africa. 3 nations that had signed a secret media pact with Traoré a month earlier. The footage was safe now. Even if Ibrahim didn't leave that room alive, the truth would. Back inside, Traoré stepped away from the conference table and approached the projection wall. He pulled a small chip from his pocket and inserted it into a console. A moment later, the screen behind him lit up. Faces filled the wall. African presidents, youth activists, tribal elders, and military commanders. A mosaic of the continent, all watching silently. This summit is no longer private, Traoré said. Now it belongs to the people. On screen, gasps and murmurs rippled. It was a secure link. Dozens of African leaders, previously kept out of the Lisbon negotiations, were now watching the session in real time. Kessler turned to Wexler, whispering, "Shut it down. We can't," she hissed. "Not unless we cut the power to the entire sector. And we're being watched too." Because she knew, if they pulled the plug now, it would confirm everything Traoré said. "President Ibrahim," a voice came through the screen. It was President Nyasha Bandela of Zimbabwe. "You have the continent's attention." Traoré nodded. "Then let me speak clearly." He turned from the screen and faced his hosts again. "You tried to shut us out of our future. You offered us security cooperation while funding the very instability you claim to fight. You demanded we choose between obedience and ruin. I choose neither. I choose sovereignty." Wexler's eyes narrowed. "So what is your proposal?" "My proposal is simple," Traoré said. "You withdraw all covert operations from African soil. You end military interventions disguised as humanitarianism. You respect our right to choose our ally. And in return, Africa rises peacefully." "You're dreaming," Rousseau said with a sneer. "No," Traoré replied. "You are, and your dream ends now." Then, without missing a beat, he stepped aside and let the screen take over. One by one, the African leaders spoke. President Samuel Obasi of Nigeria declared, "We support Burkina Faso's stance and will reconsider all foreign troop presence." President Rania Doumbia of Senegal said, "No more deals without full African consent." Even President Basil Okechukwu of Kenya, known for walking the Western line, hesitated before saying, "Perhaps it is time we took more ownership of our defense policies." Each voice was another domino, and Wexler knew they were losing the room. Not just the literal one, the global one. In the control center 2 floors above, NATO officers scrambled to contain the feed, but their efforts were delayed by cyber disruptions from unknown sources, likely Russian, possibly South African. The control room had been infiltrated digitally. The broadcast could not be stopped. Traoré walked back to the table, sat down and folded his hands. "This was supposed to be a warning," he said quietly. "A reminder that I'm not welcome in your circles. But today, you sat at my table, and you couldn't flip it." Wexler's jaw tightened. "Do you really think you can win this war of influence?" "I already have," he said, glancing toward the screen. "You built your power on secrets. I built mine on truth. And truth doesn't need an invitation." Suddenly, a soft chime rang throughout the compound, a signal from the Portuguese government. The president of Portugal, caught off guard by leaked information about the summit, had ordered immediate diplomatic clarification. The secret meeting was no longer secret. Lisbon's foreign minister was en route to apologize publicly. Wexler looked at Traoré, defeated, but burning with restrained anger. "You'll regret this, Mr. President." Traoré stood. "History is full of regrets, but I'd rather make them than inherit them." As guards escorted the delegates from the room, a new energy surged across African airwaves. The summit that never was had just begun. The drive back to Lisbon's main terminal was quiet on the surface, but beneath the silence the world was roaring. News of the clandestine meeting had already begun to leak across African and European media networks. Snippets of the summit's live feed, clips of Traoré confronting Western officials. The moment he activated the transceiver, the African leaders pledging support had been uploaded to multiple platforms in multiple languages. Despite every effort by Western cyber teams to contain the footage, the damage was done. The truth had escaped. As the convoy passed through the city, the streets seemed to lean in toward the windows, as if the buildings themselves had heard what happened, and were now watching the man who had defied an empire. Inside his SUV, President Ibrahim Traoré stared ahead, his expression unreadable. Colonel Mariam Soadogo sat across from him, scanning messages on a secure tablet. South African media is running the headline. Traoré breaks the summit wide open. Algeria's prime minister wants to meet. Ethiopia has called an emergency ministerial session. And Russia. She paused. What about Russia? Traoré asked. They want to award you their highest civilian honor for diplomatic courage. He chuckled under his breath. Tell them I appreciate it, but let's wait until we're not flying targets anymore. Back at the airfield, the Falcon 900 had been refueled and cleared for immediate departure. But before boarding, Traoré paused at the stairs. A crowd had begun to gather beyond the fences, small at first, then larger. African students, Portuguese activists, journalists who had caught wind of something extraordinary. They weren't chanting slogans, they weren't waving flags. They were simply watching, eyes wide, curious, awed. Traoré turned to the press agents waiting by the plane. Let them record this. Then he climbed to the top of the steps, stood before the aircraft's door and faced the crowd. And for the first time in 2 days, he raised his voice. Not in a private room, not behind closed doors, but out in the open. To the youth of Africa, he said, his voice carried by portable mic and dozens of phones. This summit was never meant for us. We were not invited. We were expected to follow quietly, to receive orders, to remain in the background of world decisions. He paused. But today, we did not knock. We did not ask permission. We sat at the table, and when they tried to silence us, we spoke louder. A soft cheer rose from the crowd. This is not just about Burkina Faso. It is not just about me. It is about every nation who has ever been told they are too small to matter. Let them hear us now. Africa chooses sovereignty, and we do not ask. We declare. He turned and entered the jet, the door closing behind him. The Falcon lifted off minutes later, carving a silver trail through Lisbon's dusk sky, heading back toward Ouagadougou. 48 hours later, Burkina Faso, the Unity Palace was a storm of activity. Media crews from across the continent had camped outside. Messages of support flooded government channels, statements from civil societies, Pan-African coalitions, student unions, and even private corporations. Traoré hadn't just returned home. He had returned as a signal. A ripple had turned into a wave. That morning, he stood before his council, the same wooden desk beneath his hands, the same scent of dust and change in the air. Do we expect retaliation? Miriam asked. Yes, he said. Sanctions, pressure, maybe worse, but not silence. And how do we respond? With unity. We reach out, not just to Russia or China, but to each other. The time for African alignment is now. He laid a map on the table, a new diplomatic grid. Africa trade routes, military cooperation lines, tech-sharing corridors, media coalitions. This is what they feared. Not just that we would resist, but that we would connect. That same evening, leaders from 23 African nations convened for a virtual emergency assembly. What began as a closed-door debrief turned into something more. A chart, a new bloc. The Coalition for African Sovereignty and Strategy, CAS, was officially proposed. The organization would unify diplomatic responses, protect economic independence, and form a joint cyber defense unit to repel foreign manipulation. And it had one clear founder, Ibrahim Traoré. 1 week later, global response. As predicted, Western powers responded. The U.S. Treasury placed new restrictions on Burkina Faso's central bank transactions. The EU threatened to suspend certain aid programs. NATO issued a vague statement about regional destabilization, but none of it landed cleanly, because the footage from the summit was still being shared, translated into Swahili, Zulu, Amharic, and Arabic. Youth movements across the continent had adopted the phrase, "We do not ask, we declare," as their rallying cry. In Paris, anti-imperialist protesters clashed with police. In Berlin, students held signs reading "Let Africa Rise." In Washington, a senator demanded an inquiry into covert summit operations that had violated international diplomatic norms. And in Africa, CAS held its first joint press conference, with Traoré at the center. He said only one thing: we are no longer the shadow in the room. We are the room. Epilogue. Years later, analysts would look back on the Lisbon incident as a diplomatic inflection point. Not a war, not a treaty, not a revolution with guns and tanks, but a summit that never officially happened. A summit where no one expected resistance and got revelation instead. A summit where a leader from a small, landlocked country walked into the lion's den and didn't just walk out. He left the door open behind him, so others could follow. His name would echo in the halls of universities and war rooms alike. Ibrahim Traoré, The man who wasn't supposed to matter. The man who mattered more than they could imagine.